This session is beginning. Stephen McKeown has been delayed, been a traffic snarl up, but he's the last speaker, so we hope that he'll be here by the time our first two speakers are finished. That's not offering them license to talk for as long over time as I did yesterday. Okay, so our first speaker is Dr. Jack Kavanagh of Maynooth, but shortly to be of UCD, where he'll be working on a very interesting project on the British military barracks and so on, left in Ireland, if you like, after independence. So I'll ask Jack to speak first. Jack.
All right. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the development of the National Army, okay? But before we can actually talk about the National Army, we have to talk about what it came from. So if you see it here, in January 22, we basically had three factions within the IRA. We had the pro-treaty IRA, we had the anti-treaty IRA, and we had the neutrals. Now, none of these are fixed in stone. People are moving between different factions as they go. But, you know, these are basically the three major factions we have, right? The pro-treaty faction is the smallest. It's very, very small. But it is concentrated in key areas. First Northern, first Western, Midlands, and the vast majority of the general headquarters staff. Anti-treaty faction is much larger, containing significant parts of the country. And the neutral faction is a diverse area. And actually, I think it's an area that we do need to think about in terms of future research into going beyond the 4th Northern Division and beyond sort of individuals like Florrie O'Donoghue into sort of a more, I think, longitudinal study into it. Like, what is this? What are these units doing? And how many of them remain neutrals throughout this period? Okay, so the IRA has gone through a number of structural changes on the eve of the treaty breakdown, basically. We have a brigade-based structure that becomes a divisional-based structure. We also have new recruits, sometimes known as Fusiliers, and they come in after the truce is declared in July 21. The IRA kind of functions as a semi-democratic, sort of direct democracy organization. So brigade committees will elect people within them. They're formed in that way. However, they do have an actual command structure with a general headquarters staff, a chief of staff, and a civilian minister of defense. But in practice, you know, local commanders are going to operate with a lot of leeway for individual circumstances. There's resentment, obviously, against GHQ. Obviously, you'll see this phrase a lot in the records in the archives, taking the fight to the British. There wasn't as much of that. You have local rivalry. And then, of course, the introduction of IRA divisions leads to all sorts of issues as well. So just to see it here, you have companies, then you have battalions, then you have brigades, and then you have a new superimposed structure of divisions on top of that. So just to see an example here, this is the geographic outline of the Sligo No. 1 Brigade as it existed in July 1921, 11th of July 1921. Note the scale of it. It cuts across 4 counties, essentially. A very large brigade that is then reorganized into 3 smaller brigades. This is what the battalions would have looked like. I've taken all of this information from the geographic attributes available on the military service pension website, where inside the nominal roles, they will list specific geographical attributes of where they're from. Sometimes brigades will actually give you a map drawn out in Ordnance Survey of the scale and size of different units. So this is a representation based on that, but it is built with a geographic lookup table and a model, which I will be releasing to the general public to use. This is an example of what a division would look like. This is the 2nd Southern Division. This is Ernie O'Malley's division. Note again that concentration within entire counties. That's a feature that they use when they're building these divisions. So they're merging a number of brigades into a larger area to command. So The National Army is founded on the 5th of July, 1922. They reissue the General Order system. It's called General Order Number 1, and it reconstitutes the Army under a new structure. When they're recruiting new people into this military, they split them into two different types, which I'm going to go on to in the next slide. But they split them into two different types. So they have pre-existing people who were serving before the 28th of June, 1922, and then they have people who come in after the 28th of June, 1922, right? So when they're expanding to deal with the Civil War as it's breaking out, they're viewing this new force as a temporary measure from the get-go. This is not permanent. This is not going to be a permanent buildup. They're bringing in men for a specific, typically 18-month contracts. They're going to have them in, and then they're going to go. They change the structures again within the Army, and they bring in these command districts. Command districts essentially are groups of divisions together. They're somewhat similar to Army groups in some of their structures. They don't quite operate in the same way, but that's just just an example to think about how it would be structured. The structures that are put in place under General Order Number 1 do not remain the same. They originally start with 3. By October, they have over 11. So they're expanding as they move across the country. This is important here at the end. There is only one quantitative source listing all members of the National Army for 1922, and that is the census taken on the night of the 12th of November 1922, a census which I have transcribed as part of my research. I do not recommend that for anybody. Do not transcribe a census. You will have hair at the end of it. Okay, so this is the command district, right? I've taken some of this from the actual General Order itself. So in the original General Order, they create 3 command districts, and they appoint Eoin O'Duffy, Ginger O'Connell, and Sean McKeown. Then, as they expand, they give one to W.R.E. Murphy, Emmett Dalton, Paddy O'Daly, Michael Brennan. So this is just to give you an example, again, of they're expanding as they go out, and they appoint different commanders as they need them. So within about a week after the first order, they've now got 5 command districts. And you can see here, this is how they've started to divide up the different units, right? So they're grouping them together into more cohesive command districts that can function more effectively in the field. So this is called the Call to Arms. This was published by the Free State government in the aftermath of the Battle of Dublin. And it essentially is a sort of statement of thanks for the people defeating the Republicans in Dublin, but it's also sort of laying out their very carefully worded way of saying we need more troops, but it's all very kind of carefully worded on how they need them. This is published in all major newspapers and leads to an enormous recruitment drive with people queuing around. There's reports of Great Brunswick Street and other recruiting barracks with people queuing around the block to try to get in to join up into the National Army. They decide to create this thing called the voluntary levy. The voluntary levy is essentially the structure of how the new recruitment strategy is going to be handled, right? So the fixed terms contract we talked about 18 months. They split them into 2 types. So regulars are prior to the 28th of June. Reservists are after the 28th of June, but reservists are also fighting in the field. So it's not that reservists are held in reserve. It's just a differentiation between the two. They also set the number of men they wanted to recruit per county, right? So if you think about it, the levy is designed to pull in a set percentage number of the active male population in the counties within the Free State. Okay? And that's roughly around 16% of the male population. You see it here. The map on the left is the number they've set per county. The map on the right is the total number recruited as listed on the census over this entire time period. And you can see, obviously, some counties hit their quota exactly, but the Northwest pocket is well under what they had set out to get. I think it's important just to emphasize that this volunteer levy sort of shows a couple of things. One, there's a slight overambition in terms of how many they expected to get and how representative they wanted it. But two, it does actually show that there's a certain thought process behind it. They're not just recruiting randomly. There is an actual set process behind it. Whether it works in practice is a different matter. Just have another look at recruitment here. The National Army Census gives us 3 geographic attributes. We have their home address, we have their next of kin home address, and we have their place of attestation. So we actually know where they joined up. So if you read it their way, home county, next of kin, place of attestation, right? And you see again the concentration in terms of attestments is in the counties where the National Army is present, right? So you see them, they're in Limerick, they're in Dublin, they're in Kildare, and those are going to remain as they go on. However, by August, you start to see Cork has become a major recruitment centre because they have landed in Cork at this point. And as they land in Cork, people start to join the military, right? Because there's now no barrier to them doing so. And of course, note as well in both of these that although the levy was designed within the partitionist framework, right? So it's designed for the 26th state, the recruitment is happening across the entire island throughout this whole period, August, September, October, okay? I haven't included November because it's only 12 days, so it's too small for actually be properly representative here. Another thing that happens in July with the development of the National Army is the training regime. The Officer Training Corps only really starts to get up and going in 1923. However, they do start to train men in musketry, artillery, machine gun corps, some transport, and then later engineers and signalers. And this starts from July, right? And they have a number of these reports that are sent in to the Chief of Staff listing the outputs of how many men are going through these training systems in the Curragh complex. This is just an example of what these VR2 reports look like, okay? So quite straightforward, relatively easy to follow. So what I've done is I've taken all of these reports, there's about 36 of them from the end of July right up until the 30th of December, and I've decided let's have a little graph so we can see. This is the total number of men going through some form of training, right? Whether it's infantry or artillery or whatever, during this period, okay? So it dips below 2,000 in August, but it rarely stays roughly, the average is around 2,200 throughout this whole period. But I think it's just important to note that there is an actual training system going on. How effective that training is up for debate. The outputs are up for debate, but there is an actual training regime happening. Now, this is a breakdown of the readiness in 1 week. Okay, so that's how they broke it down. So you had one column that said, these are the men that are available right now. These are the men that are available in 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then they had a running total, right? So I decided let's just break down the first week and have a look how many men are available within 1 week of training and what kind of corps are they going to go into, right? I've just started working on this, so this is just early research now. But you can see there, obviously, the vast majority of men are going into infantry, but you can see that Lewis gunners are starting to pick up, and then obviously engineers from about September onwards become more important as they're putting more men through that system. Now, the census also lists whether or not men went through the Curragh system. They have a naming system attached to the records. So they are trying to identify men who've gone through it. So this is just a simple enough breakdown. You can see here the men who've come in on the census. This is the dates they said that they've joined. I'm going to come back to the pre-June in a second. And then you see the amount of these guys who are listed as having gone through the Curragh system in some shape or form, right? In terms of the recruitment from January to June, because the National Army doesn't exist, you have a kind of a loose coalition of pro-treaty units. We're going to have to take this group as expressing a pro-treaty sentiment, right? So essentially they're saying, I'm in an IRA unit at that time, but I am retrospectively saying that I'm in the National Army from that date. That's how we're going to have to take it, because a lot of those guys actually are in IRA units during the War of Independence. Although, unfortunately, because of the nature of the military service pension records not existing as a database, the lookup is very tedious. We can't do a quick one-to-one search. You're going to have to do it by hand. It's manual, and it takes a very long time. Okay, so this is just quickly, I'm just going to quickly go through casualties. I know the other two guys are going through that as well. So I built a small data set of casualties, National Army casualties from July to November. I wanted to match it to the census so I could see. Casualties are on average about 3 a day. Vast majority are happening during operations, although there is a significant and continuous number dying from accidents of various types. They occur across the entire island within the Free State borders. There are some National Army people who are killed in the north, but I haven't included them for a couple of reasons. One, the 1 or 2 cases we have tend to happen when they were in civilian attire or civilian life. And in at least one case, it does seem to have been something that had nothing to do with the Army whatsoever. But that is something that I am thinking about. How do we deal with National Army people who are from the north, of which there are significant numbers, but are dying in the north, either killed by specials or the Loyalist Guard or one of these other sort of paramilitary groups that are working in the north at the time. The 3 worst days for National Army casualties on this data set are in August, September, and October. They tend to be grouped ambushes. Here you can see this is just a chart, simple enough. Just so you can see the casualties. They don't really jump up that high with the exception of those 3 dates. So it's a continual small level as opposed to large casualties on one specific day that overwhelm the whole data set. This is just another couple of maps just so you can quickly see. On the left is where they died. On the right is where they're from. So you see here in July, you've got men from Dublin and Limerick who are dying predominantly in Dublin and Limerick, right? And then there's obviously some men dying from Cork as well. And then again, they're dying in Cork and Kerry as they move in there in August in the operations. Up in Mayo, when they start to lose control of the area that they thought they controlled before. Cork again. And again, back into Munster. So you see the distribution, large parts of the country, not a huge amount of casualties. We're talking very low levels here. This is just all of them broken down by electoral districts. You can see all of that gray space. We're not talking about a huge amount of casualties in every parish, in every village. But again, it's concentrated around urban areas and ambushes and that kind of thing. So you can see there's a concentration in the south, but also you can see it in the more remote, more hard to get to rural areas. Just a quick numerical breakdown so you can see the percentage. Essentially, the casualties are so low. I mean, the National Army, while it affected the people who were within it, I mean, they could have dealt with far higher casualties. If you just see the amount that they're bringing in every single month, right? They could have dealt with much higher rates and still been able to function. And that's me.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, our next speaker is Michael Keane, who, of course, will be familiar. Anybody who works in the military archives and familiar with the military service pensions collection has a lot to thank Michael for, even before he speaks.
The check is in the post, is it you?
Yeah.
Great, thanks very much.
Signed by Donald Trump.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the organising committee for this, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you today about the military service pensions collections and in particular about the Civil War casualties within it. Sorry, hang on, I think I accidentally jumped ahead of myself there. Just before going on any further, so just to explain, I'm just going to touch on briefly the background to the information within the collection, where the information relating to those deaths actually comes from within the collection, and then we look at some of the facts and figures and what they tell us about the duration and intensity of the conflict and who took part in it. There will be a bit of overlap with some of the stuff Jack has covered as well too. but hopefully that won't be too much of a problem. Okay, so the material you're looking at is obviously generated from material in the collection. It relates primarily to dependence applications made in respect of those who died during the conflicts. And those applications were made under the Army Pensions Act from 1923 onwards. A much smaller cohort then relates to the posthumous service medal application files. And then in the case of Erskine Childers, you're looking at a group of files that we found relating to him elsewhere in the collection. As regards, when we look at these figures now, as regards how, definitive or complete they would be, I would not make any claims towards that, for the main reason being that not all families made applications, either as dependents or in respect of posthumous medals. And the most prominent examples, as you can see there, would be Cathal Brugha and Joseph McKelvey. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail in a little while. The other thing to say is, because the work on the collection is ongoing, hopefully we may yet still come across further files relating to other casualties from the period. So, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about deaths in the Civil War period from the collection? First of all, we're talking about deaths that took place between the 28th of June 22 and the 31st of December 24. Now, obviously, taking the 28th of June 22 as your starting point is a no-brainer. It's the attack on the forecourts, etc. The reason why we chose to extend it out until 31st December 24, there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, despite the dump arms and ceasefire orders in May 23, you do continue to see violent incidents and deaths continuing on throughout 23 and on into 24, albeit at a greatly reduced level, of course. Secondly, you still have a number of Republican or anti-treaty prisoners who die while they're imprisoned or interned during that period as well. And finally, you also have individuals from both sides of the conflict who continue to die as a result of the wounds or injuries they received during the service, or from diseases that they contracted while they were serving as well. Just getting ahead of myself there. Okay. So you've seen the deaths included. Now, there are other deaths recorded in the collection as well. And the ones of those that I'm excluded now when I'm talking about this are deaths that were deemed not to have taken place during or arising from active service, deaths of individuals who weren't found to be members of one of the organizations recognized under the legislation. And those organizations, in terms of the Civil War, you're looking at the National Army, the IRA, Fianna Gael and Commandant, and so on. Then you have deaths from disease not deemed to have been a result of their military service, and then accidental deaths which were due to the victim's own negligence. Okay, so what are we talking about in terms of numbers then? Well, to date we have processed files relating to 1,077 individuals who meet the criteria that I've just spoken about. Of those, the largest percentage, 662 or 61%, are pro-treaty, 415 or 39% are anti-treaty. 1,073 are men, 4 are women, and deaths have been recorded as taking place in 29 of the 32 counties. And I'll come back to that point briefly later on. And one death actually takes place outside of the island of Ireland altogether, and that death relates to Colonel Sean Quinn, whose death in France, of all places, in 1924 was deemed to have been attributable to disease he contracted during his service. Now, to go back again just briefly to how accurate or complete these figures might be, there isn't really, across both sides of the conflict, there isn't really a national figure that you can compare to, I don't think, as of yet. But I think the UCC Cork fatality register on their website is worth comparison with. And they cover just deaths in County Cork, obviously. So at the moment, we have 38 or 72% of the anti-treaty casualties that they record for County Cork, 98 or 87% of the pro-treaty casualties. So that evens out as about 80% overall. And hopefully that would be reflected nationwide as well, give or take, obviously, variations from place to place. So let's dig in a bit deeper now to that information. So first of all, as you've seen already, the deaths on the pro-treaty side were of a much greater number. And that's reflected here. So you have 650 deaths in the National Army, 397 for the IRA, 14 na Fianna Éireann, 8 national forces, and I'll explain what that is in a second, 4 from the Commandant, and 4 members of An Garda Síochána as well. Now, national forces, that represents a grouping of individuals who, and this definition turns up on their dependent applications. They're basically individuals who, although not formally attested or didn't formally join the National Army, they did fight on the pro-treaty side or serve on the pro-treaty side, and they were recognised as having served under the direction of the forces under the control of the Minister for Defence at that time. Okay, so to go in a little bit deeper, looking at deaths by location, first of all on a higher up level as it were. So the breakdown of deaths that we have at present by county and province, you can see there. I suppose, I don't think there are too many surprises to be found there. What's interesting, I suppose, maybe to point out, would be that, of course, obviously, the number of deaths in an area reflects the intensity of the conflict in that particular area. But you do also, I think, have to take into account the presence of, for want of a better word, particular, I suppose, installations, if you like, within particular counties. So, for example, with Kildare and Westmeath in particular, I would argue that you have to take into account there, obviously, the whole Curragh complex. So you had the various internment camps there, Tintown 1, 2 and 3, and you had the Newbridge internment camp as well as the military barracks and the military hospital. And the fact that 7 executions took place there. And again with Westmeath, because of the importance of Athlone and as a military centre, and the fact that you had 7 executions taking place there as well. Just briefly to comment on the counties included there from Northern Ireland. Those deaths in Antrim and Armagh, there's 3 there altogether, they relate to individuals who died as a result of disease attributable to service. So they had gone home after their active service period, so to speak, had ceased, and then died from disease there. The death in Derry is different. That relates to a National Army captain, William Brown, who was fatally wounded in a place called Kildare in County Donegal on the 11th of July, was brought to what was the nearest hospital in Derry City, and he died there the following day on the 12th of July 22. So just very briefly then to compare the numbers of deaths per county and then look at the number of executions. And again, you can see the correlation there again, Dublin, Kerry in particular, but also with Kildare and Westmeath. It's interesting, I think, for me personally, because I'm from Mayo, so I'm biased, that you have counties with relatively high levels of violence and casualties, such as Mayo and Sligo, that didn't have any executions at all. I think that's worth noting. It's also worth noting as well, on the other end of the spectrum, as it were, that you have a county like Carlow, where we've recorded or found files only for 6 casualties to date, yet there was an execution there. Or Cork at the other end of the spectrum, much higher level of casualties, but only 1 execution took place there. Just to say about the executions and what you find out about them in the collection. Now overall, I'm sure as you all know, there were 81 official executions took place between November 22 and May 23. Of that 81, 77 have always been recognised, for want of a better word, as legitimate IRA members, or members of the anti-treaty forces. 4 were considered civilians who were executed for their participation in things like armed robberies. To date, we have found files for 72 of the 77 officially recognised IRA executed, and 2 of the 4 civilians. So to dig in deeper again, we're very lucky in that on the vast majority of files you get the exact location of death given. There's a massive number of locations recorded for the 1,077 dead, 622 in all, and obviously you can't represent that here. But this gives you an idea, the table there on the right-hand side, sorry, of the screen. There you have the locations with the highest number of casualties, those with 5 or more. Not surprisingly, perhaps, highest numbers of deaths are taking place in either hospitals or else military barracks or prisons. But of course, obviously, you have, outside of that, the highest number of casualties obviously is found in Ballyseedy in County Kerry. But it's not just the killing of the prisoners there in March 23. You also have an IRA member killed there in September 22. And just to note briefly as well, further down there in the table, you'd see 6 deaths as recorded both at Glenamoy, County Mayo, and Carrigafuka, County Cork. And they both took place on the one day, 16th of September 22, I think. And that date, with 18 casualties, is the highest individual date in terms of casualties that we've found so far working through the collection. And on that date, there was 16 pro-treaty members killed or died and 2 anti-treaty members. But of course, as well as the place of death, the locations where individuals were wounded and injured before going on to die elsewhere is important in terms of the spread of the conflict and where it was most intense and where the ambushes and incidents were actually taking place. We're lucky, again, that there's quite a good bit of information relating to those individuals and where they were wounded to be found on the files as well. And as it says there, we found information for 266 locations for individuals where they were wounded or injured, but then ended up dying elsewhere, usually, of course, in hospitals, obviously. And just also to point out as well, on the previous table, you may or may not have noticed that there's 13 deaths recorded there for St. Vincent's Hospital in Dublin. 5 of those deaths were as a result of injuries or woundings that took place outside County Dublin altogether. So as I say, knowing or looking at the locations where people are actually wounded and injured is also of immense value when researching the Civil War conflict. So obviously with a lot of the files, or the vast majority, you get the exact date of death, and if you break it down like this as a timeline, you get a pretty good indication of the intensity of the conflict from June 22 onwards. As is widely known, of course, the most intense period there would be July to September 22, excuse me, as the fighting spreads right across the country. And I guess as you have, relatively speaking, larger concentrations of forces facing off against each other. As the war turns into a more guerrilla phase, as 22 progresses, you see the numbers of casualties beginning to drop, or the numbers of deaths, I should say, beginning to drop. It jumps again in January because of the large number of executions in that month. I think we have files relating to 31 individuals executed, official executions, and 2 civilians as well executed that month. Drops again in February before spiking enormously there in March, mainly due to the events in County Kerry, but also the ongoing executions, before finally dropping off again there April, May, but continuing on at a low level, albeit, until the end of 1924. It's also worth noting that apart from June 1922, the only other months where the death totals on the anti-treaty side outstrip the pro-treaty side are January, March, and April 23. Okay, and this is of interest. And one of the most interesting, surprising, and maybe even to some extent shocking things we found is the high level of accidental deaths. Now, I know Jack referred to this as well too. It does occur on both sides, but most particularly on the pro-treaty side. So to date, we have found just less than 1/3 of all the casualties on the pro-treaty side were due to what's termed accidental deaths. Now, in fairness, accidental deaths covers a multitude. It covers everything from individuals who, say, are fatally injured or killed when the transport they're travelling in crashes, all the way across, obviously, to someone who dies as a result of the accidental discharge of a colleague or a comrade's weapon. And it's interesting there on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see there's an extract from a letter from the Department of Defence to the Army Finance Officer. And he was writing about the accidental shooting of National Army Captain Frederick Hamilton Lidwell, who was killed on the 22nd of December 22. Now, the writer is writing in June 23, and in that letter, he's actually discussing 2 points primarily. Firstly, he's discussing whether the category of accidental deaths is a legitimate category for dependents to apply in respect of their relative's death while serving with the National Army. And then he's also briefly kind of looking at why there was such a high number of accidental deaths in the National Army. Now, as you can see there, he accepts completely that accidental deaths is a legitimate category for dependents to claim under. His reasoning has regards to the high level of deaths, or accidental deaths. He says it was an army hastily recruited and not very well trained. Now, I think in fairness, it has to be said that really further research is needed on this to be definitive on it. But it also has to be said that on a number of the files, you do see evidence again and again that the individuals who were, for want of a better word, responsible for the accidental discharge of the weapons, they were relatively newly recruited, or else either had very little or maybe even were claiming to have had no training, either in weaponry at all or in the particular weapons they were handling when the accident took place. Now, as to why it should be so much higher with the pro-treaty than the anti-treaty, again, I think really further research really is needed. I know I've heard two basic arguments, and you can make of these what you will. One is that the IRA members had greater experience with weaponry, maybe not. The other is that you're simply dealing with numbers. That with the pro-treaty on the National Army side, you simply had greater numbers of individuals, poorly trained or not, who had greater access and on a greater level of frequency to arms than on the IRA side, particularly when on the pro-treaty side, you're liable to be executed if you're caught in possession of arms. So they're only going to carry arms, mainly from November 22 onwards, albeit, unless they absolutely have to, or if they're involved in an engagement. So another interesting bit of information we got from the files is the amount of deaths of ex-British servicemen on both sides of the conflict. Now, of course, traditionally, there's always been a view that a large number, or a relatively large number, of ex-British servicemen served, on the pro-treaty side. And of course, it was a very handy propaganda stick for the anti-treaty side to beat the pro-treaty side with. So you do have that coming into play. And of course, it was also a source of some, I suppose, resentment, for want of a better word, amongst the ex-IRA members who were serving in the National Army as well. And just to explain where that information comes from on the files, because I think it can be of interest. Firstly, on the pro-treaty side, you often see officials from the British Ministry of Pensions getting in touch with their Free State counterparts, basically saying it's come to our attention that Private Joe Murphy was killed in County Kerry on the 15th of September last, and can you confirm, etc. And when you get that, you get a nice bit of extra information, because you get the individual's regiment that they served with while they served with the British Army, or whatever section of the British service they served with. And you also sometimes, if you're lucky, get a regimental number as well too, which is of course very handy for further research. The other way it turns up, of course, is in the dependents' claims, because someone in receipt of a British Army pension, that is a source of income, obviously, to them, but also, by extension, for the dependents or the relatives who are claiming in respect to them as well, too. So that's generally how they turn up on the files. It's just worth noting, well, from my own point of view at least anyway, that even though there's only 21 ex-British servicemen recorded as being killed or dying on the anti-treaty side, that 1/3 of them, 7, were executed, were amongst the official accepted IRA executed, which seems a relatively high proportion. And even then, when you take into account that means that 7 of the 77 were ex-British servicemen, which again, just less than 1/10, is a fairly high proportion. Finally, just to turn to some of the socioeconomic information that can be found on the files. Because of the dependency claims, you do tend to get a bit of information about the individual's previous occupation, either before serving with the National Army or before or during their IRA service. So, to date, we found details regarding occupations for 932 of the 1,077, and there's 587 different occupations recorded. And that table there is just a sample of that. It's occupations where 3 or more of the dead are recorded as having these as their occupations. Now you can see, largely speaking, it reflects, I suppose, the rural and agricultural nature of the country at the time. And just to explain, you see on the fourth from the top there, there's what appears like a doubling up, farmer's son and farm labour. Just to explain that's simply a case where you've got somebody, yes, they're working or assisting on the family holding, however big or small it is, but to supplement their income and the family income, they're then working on other neighbouring or on a seasonal basis, maybe a good distance away on other holdings. So as I say, this is just a flavour of some of the information on the files in the collection, and which I think and believe will with further research, can tell us even more about the nature of the Civil War and who took part on it. And just briefly, to look at where you can find that information yourself. So our web page is on our web presence is on the Military Archives website. This is our main page on the Military Archives website. You can see there's different sections there relating to various areas of the 1916-23 period as a whole. The top right-hand side there, you can see the Civil War section. If you click on that, again, there's further resources which you can use to tell you more about the conflict and about how it's represented within the collection. And obviously, I would urge you all to make as much use of it as you can. Thank you very much.
I don't see, is Stephen, has he materialised yet?
I don't think he's far off. Do you want to do a Q&A?
Yeah, we'll do a Q&A. And can I start? In relation to accidental deaths, I mean, in the Dead of the Irish Revolution study from 16 to 21, I think the British military is something like, it's huge, 23% or something thereabouts who die.
Right.
So it's not just the new army that has troubles. What it is young fellas coming in and being poorly trained, whether it's the British Army or not, and then accidentally shooting people is a huge phenomenon. As I say, during the War of Independence, let alone, with the National Army.
Yeah.
And the other point is that you made it indirectly, is that if you're in the IRA in 1920 or 21, most of the time, the last thing you want to be caught in possession of is a weapon, right? Whereas if you're a 15-year-old soldier, right, just recruited, you might have lied about your age. The one thing you have to have most of the time when you're on duty is a weapon. So I think that's part of it. And also, obviously, the fact that the National Army very quickly had relatively quite a lot of equipment and quite a lot of ammunition and so on. I think that's... So I wonder to what extent in other armies,
Yeah.
if we looked at whatever they call them now, blue on blue and so on, but if we looked at that era, how anomalous was, say, the British military experience in the War of Independence, or was this just kind of what happens when you get, especially when you put teenagers and guns and
Yeah, no, I
training?
completely agree. I mean, I think it would be really interesting to compare across armies at that particular time.
Yeah,
Just to see what the figures would show.
right. Sorry, I had to ask the first question, which is quite unlike me. Yeah, we have a question. Hold on, we get the mic down to you. Hold on.
Sorry, you said they collected a levy of...
To me or to Michael?
Pardon?
So to me or to Michael? Me.
I think so, yeah. But how did they collect the levy? I mean...
How did they recruit the men, or how did they set the levy in general?
Yeah, but there was a levy, wasn't there, of 6 shillings a week or something they were getting in the army. How did they collect the levy?
No, you're talking. Oh, I know what you're talking about. Oh no, that's when you mean the IRA when they set those levies on businesses during the War of Independence. That's not what I'm talking about here.
No, I thought there was they joined the army. What was it, for 18 months? Mm-hmm. But
Yeah.
I thought you said there was a levy.
They called it a levy.
Yeah,
They
but-
called the recruitment intake a levy, which is confusing. I know.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
what they called it. It's not a taxation. Do you get me? They just used the word.
Yeah.
For the numbers they wanted
Aye.
to recruit.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they paid them, you were saying 10 shillings a week?
Essentially, yeah, they started, and then they went up a bit. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but there wasn't the civil service. So how did they collect? How did they collect the money?
Well, this is paying out money. They paid 10
Oh, it
shillings
was-
a week
but-
to
but
recruit.
it was out the money was going.
Yeah,
Money's
because the
going
term
out.
levy, as Jack was saying, is
They
really
just-
the desired target number that they want to recruit. It's not actually a compulsory. It's not Mr. Putin with his reserves.
It's not a conscription. It's not conscription. Yeah.
Yeah.
We never had an issue there.
Other questions?
I just wondering about the executions carried out by the anti-treaty forces.
Yeah.
J.P. Duggan, in his study of the Irish Army, has estimated, I think, that 53 executions were carried out. Obviously, with an army that may not have great records or anything, it's more difficult. But has any study been done? Is there any information available on those executions? Some civilians are accused of informing, some Free State soldiers as well.
Yeah.
it's much harder to do because, firstly, you're relying on there's two things you're relying on: the information that you actually find, if there is a file for the deceased person, for the casualty, the level of information recorded on that, and then you're hoping maybe somewhere elsewhere in the pensions collection that somebody, as part of their service pension claim, will say, "Oh, I took part in the shooting of whoever." So it's quite difficult at this stage to record because with the work on the pensions collection being ongoing. But I would certainly hope, I completely agree with you, Yasmin. I think it's something that does need further research, and hopefully as we go further along we'll be able to kind of retroactively look back and pick up that information, because you will find recorded in the entries for all these files details of, if individuals claim to have taken part in particular shootings. We do record that. But the other problem, of course, you have is that sometimes when they were talking about these killings, they just refer to, took part in the execution of a spy or an informer. They don't actually name the victim. And so then you're having to jump to conclusions, which isn't always possible, unfortunately, from the amount of information on the file. But I think like the work that Eoin and Dáithír Cuaráin did with the War of Independence did, I think that should hopefully serve as a template then for the Civil War period, and use the information we have and from other sources.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, just wonder about civilian casualties. Did they apply for compensation or?
A very small number of, for want of a better word, pure or real civilians. There were a very, very, very small number under the Military Service Pensions Acts, or under the Army Pensions Acts, because one of the qualifying criteria was that you had to be a member of one of these organisations, and most people realised that and didn't apply under that legislation. You do get the odd one, and then I suppose you have these other individuals, for want of a better way of putting it. Like we have two of the so-called civilians who were executed during the Civil War, Luke Burke and Michael Greeny, I think are their names. And they both had IRA service, definitely, at some point. And with, in the case of, I think it was Greeny, the fact that he was supposedly not acting under orders or whatever is fairly hotly disputed on his file. So it's a bit of a grey area, but sorry, I'm going all around the houses here. But it's just a short answer, no, very, very few, relatively speaking, of civilian applications.
Wouldn't civilian applications have gone through the compensation committees, like for?
A bit louder,
Yeah.
sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying that I think that probably a lot of civilian claims would have probably gone through the Free States compensation scheme that they set up. So if you're shelling a town or whatever and someone gets killed in that, they'd go through that scheme. Just to go back to the first fella there is a doctorate out of Maynooth about 12, 14 years ago, B.T. Murphy's, Timothy Murphy's thesis. He did a doctorate on the Free States execution policy. So he might have a few bits and pieces in there that might be handy. That's available online.
But back to the point about IRA executions, because it's almost never made, what they call executions, but how many there are. Obviously in Northern Ireland as well as in the 26 counties, which is a general question. I just to throw it back to me about the period from January to June 22, because that isn't a peaceful period in any part of Ireland and so on. And when I'm just wondering in terms of National Army casualty, because I'm trying to work through the list at the moment. And do you start in January? Because there's people called.
Yeah.
Or do you?
It's really difficult because, as you were saying, you have people who are the IRA or are the National Army.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a grey area. Yeah. It depends in some circumstances. On the when you have a file for the deceased individual, they do explicitly say or recognise them as a member of the national forces, as it were.
Right.
So that makes it a little bit easier, but it's not true in all cases.
Right. I'm very pleased. Thanks for that, guys. Stephen McKeown, you're here. Oh, you're going to set it up. I'm very pleased that Stephen has actually woken up and have a good sleep.
It took me 3.5 hours to get here.
Right.
If I had two different roads, there's been a major accident on the M7. I do apologise.
Right.
Come in by Blessington eventually.
Right.
I'll go through the Wicklow Mountains.
Go away. Anyway, well, that's a good excuse. So we're getting. Do you want to wait till your thing is uploaded?
No, we can work on.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to introduce Commandant Stephen McKeown, who's the second in command of a battalion in Kilkenny, who was in his day in charge of the military archives. He's had a distinguished military career. He's also, unlike me, I failed French. He's a fluent French speaker. He's been an instructor in the French Military College, and he's about to address us now. Sorry, Stephen.
Again, all Ganis on Dara Brigade, a Gwyn Ushla on Common Star Milton a Heron, a Gwyn Ushla Sawalia Erlina, August a Gwyn Ushla on Shaw. Stephen McCone is my name, as the good professor has pointed out. I'm pleased to be here today, not least because I have a long association with the barracks and with the military archives, and it's really, I suppose, a great privilege and a pleasure to be asked to come and speak, not having been here in a number of years. And I'd like to, I suppose, applaud the Military Archives and the Military History Society for putting this conference together, and to recognise people, for example, like I see at the back, who won't appreciate me saying it, but Commandant Victor Lang, who we owe an awful lot to, in fact, in terms of the person who kept everything going when things were meagre. And a lot of the sources that our contributors have relied on today and yesterday, in fact, were assured by Commandant Lang during the lean years prior to the decade of centenaries. And my talk today is about the National Army personnel who served during the conflict, the Civil War, and why or how it is that the state has forgotten them. And if you go to the next slide there, or I can push it, can I? Next, see that one, yeah. So this is what I propose to speak about today, ladies and gentlemen, for the next 20 minutes or so. And I'm going to, suppose, take a little bit of a more, I suppose, esoteric look at the concept of commemoration, the landscape of commemoration in Ireland. I'm going to make a brief comparison with the Great War, the First World War dead, and then I'm going to analyse, if you like, the evidence, as it were, around commemoration in Ireland for the National Army war dead, specifically in ceremonies, in military, in material culture, and indeed in our own culture within the Defence Forces and within the Army. And then I'm just going to touch on some broad themes, such as, I suppose, history or historiography, ethical remembering, or what An Tuchtran, the President, has called Machnamh, and then finally just maybe pose some questions about Irish strategic culture and if the way we commemorate is in any way helpful in terms of reflecting on our strategic culture. Let's talk about this part. I mean, people will know that's the Island Bridge War Memorial designed by Edwin Lutyens. But I'm going to start off by talking about Private James Clark. And Private James Clark was a 19-year-old soldier in the National Army when his small party was ambushed by anti-treaty forces near Tubbercurry, County Sligo, in late November 1922. And he died, according to the pension records in military archives, I quote, almost immediately from the wounds he received, leaving behind his parents and 5 siblings who were wholly dependent on his income. His mother's application for a dependence pension, which is dated 29th of November 23, pleads that the family had received not even his pay due to him at time of death or funeral expenses. And I think Private Clark's example is a small but poignant glimpse back at just one fragment in the reality of conflict in Ireland almost 100 years ago. There's no grave marker for Private Clark. Private Clark does not feature in any memorial, and there is no roll of honour listing Private Clark. And he's one of up to 1,000 personnel, as we heard from Lisa Dolan's excellent contribution yesterday, up to 1,000 personnel in the National Army who died during or as a result of the conflict. So this paper seeks to explore how it is that one cohort of Ireland's Civil War casualties, the soldiers who died on the government side, have been effectively forgotten even as the state reaches the conclusion of the so-called decade of centenaries, and indeed as we reach the conclusion of the centenary of that war. And a number of obvious questions arise here. Why does Ireland not commemorate or even remember those who died in the service of its armed forces, even while commemorating the Irish who fought in the British forces? How can we usefully explore these questions within the confines of history or even historiography? And what, if anything, as I alluded to earlier, does the way in which Ireland commemorates its war dead tell us about the status of the military in Ireland and indeed the state's strategic culture? The Irish Civil War of 1922 to 23, as I think we've heard already, was by any standards a small war. And while some historians, notably Professor Halpin, are attempting to estimate how many people, military and civilian combined, died during the entire revolutionary period, and we have now reliable data for the War of Independence, it seems unbelievable that we still have no idea how many people died in total during the Irish Civil War, and that a list has never been accurately compiled. Historians also differ regarding the extent of the war's impact. Tom Garvin has argued that the war, while bitter, was rather like a large riot. Charles Townsend points out that the war, and indeed the wider Irish revolutionary period, was comparatively unremarkable in the international context in terms of the casualties during the Great War which preceded it. And I quote, "The casualty list for 3 or even 6 years in Ireland was routinely exceeded in a single day's fighting in France during that war," unquote. That said, the trauma of civil wars is that they are more inherently divisive and destructive in society than perhaps any other form of conflict. They therefore should not be measured solely or even primarily in terms of fatalities, as Townsend has argued. Anne Dolan, posing the question of why Ireland's revolutionary violence was so comparatively tame when it could have been far worse in the broader European context, and we think of Finland and later of Spain, has similarly pointed out that even if lethal violence was limited for a variety of social and cultural reasons, this fact serves perhaps to highlight just how successful non-lethal forms of violence were in achieving their aims during the period. And I would refer, for example, to Gemma Clark's work on gender-based sexual violence during the war, which we often don't speak about. In any case, while historians may differ as to what constitutes a war, scholars of strategic studies, and I'll put myself in that bracket, Professor Hoyt, if you will allow, can perhaps afford to be more categoric. If, as Colin Gray has argued, Eoin von Clausewitz, that war is political behaviour using the agency of force, then the conflict that raged in Ireland from June 22 to May 23 was indeed a war. The Civil War was politics with other means, in that its use ad bellum on the state side was the democratic mandate provided by the ratification of the December 1921 treaty, bolstered later by the overwhelmingly pro-treaty candidates returned in the general election of June 1922. As I mentioned, up to 1,000 soldiers of the National Army died, therefore, in prosecuting what was ostensibly an extension of the political and democratic will of the Irish people, or at least the Irish people outside of the 6 counties that would become Northern Ireland. It is worth pointing out that the National Army's direct antecedent was the Irish Volunteers and the IRA, and that the Army later became the Modern Defence Forces under the 1923 Temporary Provisions Act, which rooted it in legislation. In other words, the National Army was, by any measure of the term, the legitimate army of a democratic nation state. It would follow that the new Irish state might therefore seek to honour, or at least to commemorate, the men who died, often in horrific circumstances, serving according to the wishes of the government and the majority of the people. Now, before considering the subject of this paper, specifically the National Army War Dead, I think it's appropriate firstly to consider how the largest cohort of Irish war dead, namely those who served in the British forces in the Great War in particular, are commemorated in Ireland. And we've had a look at Island Bridge, and here we have members of our friends in the Royal Irish Regiment alongside Army personnel at the commemoration in Grange Gorman in 2016 for soldiers of the British Army who died fighting us during the Rising. A narrative had existed for quite some time that Ireland, had looked uncharitably at the commemoration of war dead with the British forces, despite the obvious fact that an estimated 35 to 40,000 who died were Irish. Some historians, however, notably Keith Jeffrey, have challenged this notion that Ireland, at least before the emergency or Second World War, had actively forgotten its war dead in the British forces. And that ceremony I referred to in May of 2016, which I had the honour of being MC for, which took place at Grange Gorman near what is now McKee Barracks, commemorated for the first time the soldiers on the British side who fought in the Rising. It seemed a world away from what has been characterised as the somewhat homogenous 1966 Easter Rising commemorations. And we might allow ourselves to say that the event perhaps represented a high point in terms of the inclusivity that the Irish state and indeed its people sought from this decade of centenaries. But if Irish service in the British forces was at times through the 20th century muted, or recognition of that service was muted in official Ireland, it could not be said to be so now. By far the most impressive war memorial in Ireland in scale, design and impact is the Edwin Lutyens designed National War Memorial Gardens at Island Bridge, which were completely restored in the late 1980s. John Turpin has argued that Island Bridge is the finest World War I memorial in the South, finer in fact than any of the War of Independence memorials, due in part to Lutyens' own ability. How is it then that in Ireland, where a war of independence was fought against the British forces, where attempts at conscription in 1918 precipitated a political crisis and a landslide victory for the then Sinn Féin party, that the state's monument to the dead of its own forces, to those who essentially ensured its survival as a political entity, are so much less impressive? So turning to evidence of commemoration of the National Army war dead in Ireland, we can have a look at ceremonies. At state ceremonial level, there is no single event to commemorate the National Army war dead. This is unlike, say, the Armistice Day commemoration, which takes place on each Remembrance Sunday in Island Bridge, in which the state participates, sending a national colour party. Or unlike the state's 1916 Rising commemoration held at the GPO each Easter. The only event at which the National Army fallen could be construed to be part of is the National Day of Commemoration, which usually takes place at the Royal Hospital Kilmainham and latterly at Collins Barracks on the Sunday closest to the 11th of July, which you will know is the date of the 1921 Anglo-Irish Truce. First instituted in 1986, the National Day of Commemoration aims at, quote, commemorating all those Irish men and Irish women who died in past wars or on service with the United Nations. It therefore, in a very non-offensive and Irish way, accommodates any Irish soldier or civilian who died anywhere, from Clontarf in 1014 to Fontenoy in 1745 to Normandy in 1944. And obviously I'm being mischievous here, but to remain cynical for a moment, the event might even accommodate Irish people who died fighting on the side of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq, ISIS, Iraq and Syria in recent conflicts. And you might think that's an outrageous suggestion. But when you consider the fact that 40 such fighters, for example, Khalid Kelly, or Terence Kelly as he was known, an Irishman born in the Dublin Liberties who killed himself in a suicide bomb attack in Iraq in November 2016 fighting for ISIS. 40 such fighters left our shores in the recent past, many of them presumably Irish citizens. The National Day also, technically, could accommodate Irish soldiers who may have fought in the British Army against the Irish volunteers in Dublin in 1916, or indeed later with Franco in Spain in 1936. Indeed, this point of the origins of the National Day was a bone of contention when the event was inaugurated at Dublin's Garden of Remembrance in 1986, drawing complaints from the old IRA Association, who argued that the garden designed by Daithí Hanley was to be, I quote, dedicated to the memory of all those who gave their lives in the cause of Irish freedom, and was supposed to commemorate only those who had died for Ireland. Now, I'll stop being mischievous and say that it seems obvious that the spirit, if not the word, of the National Day could hardly stretch to accommodate the memory of those Irish people who, as individual exceptions, may have fought for causes completely at odds with Irish core values, such as ISIS. Nevertheless, I would put it to you that Irish values have been seen to change over time. A clear example of such ambivalence was the 2012 pardon afforded to Irish personnel who deserted from the Defence Forces during the Second World War or emergency period. And quite apart from the fact that the narrative assumed, without evidence, that the circa 5,000 men who deserted all went on to join the Allied forces, it was surprising that a state which had declared itself avowedly neutral should retrospectively decide that desertion of personnel from its own forces in time of war and severe risk to the state to fight with a belligerent force was something to be commended. The Irish state of today is, of course, far more accommodating and magnanimous in terms of its inclusiveness and commemoration, as we've seen, but it remains ambivalent. How does Ireland, therefore, define the limits of what is politically or morally acceptable in terms of commemoration? Or is pragmatism perhaps more highly valued than principle in the Irish context? Aside from living state commemorative events, the presence or absence of the National Army war dead in the material culture of Ireland's commemorative landscape can tell us much. For example, the only physical state memorials which could be taken to include the National Army war dead are located at Dublin's Merrion Square and Glasnevin Cemetery. The former location is of significance since it is located directly across from Leinster House Lawn, the site of the original Collins, Griffith and latterly O'Higgins cenotaph. Officially entitled An Dún Cuimhneacháin, the National Memorial by the artist Brian King in Archbishop Ryan Park at Merrion Square is again dedicated rather loosely as the National Memorial to members of the Defence Forces who died in the service of the state. There is no accompanying inscription to indicate who died and in what conflict they were fighting. Glasnevin therefore holds the only designated national site for commemoration of the National Army war dead at the cemetery's until very recently dilapidated army plot, but again without any explicit reference to the Civil War, where the state suffered by far its largest casualties since its inception. And finally, in this brief survey of the Irish commemorative landscape vis-à-vis the National Army war dead, we turn to the Defence Forces itself. Within the organisational culture of the Defence Forces, it is striking to note how little room there is for commemoration of the Civil War dead. The official Defence Forces roll of honour exclusively takes into account those who died on UN peacekeeping operations. There is rarely any reference to the far greater number of fallen in the Civil War, or indeed even to those who died in training and on operations, for example, the clearing of sea mines during the Second World War period, for that matter. Nor, contrary to what one might expect, is there any single location where one can view an entire list of Defence Forces personnel who died on operations since the state's foundation. This may well be because of the fact that the prevailing strategic culture within Ireland has cultivated a uniquely Irish version of what its armed forces are supposed to do, based on a notional military neutrality, what Professor O'Halpin describes as that most convenient, malleable and inexpensive of doctrines. What has been described as Ireland's policy of constructive ambivalence when it comes to foreign and defence policy is perhaps also reflected in Irish political culture, and in turn how historical events such as Irish desertions from the Defence Forces during the emergency are perceived. The official roll of honour demonstrates that UN operations have in some measure defined the Army's culture and represent a safe space for commemoration, while the narrative around the Civil War has all but precluded any mention of the proportionately far higher losses there. While later politically inconvenient, it is impossible to ignore the fact that those who fought and died on the National Army side in 1922 to 23 were fighting for the state, to quote O'Halpin again, as a national military force under the control of a civilian government. Finally, in my survey of the commemoration of the National Army war dead, I'd like to talk briefly about history, moral intensity and ethical remembering, because I think this has impacted on that narrative I mentioned and how we perceive our own dead from the Civil War. It can be argued that the Irish Civil War narratives have perhaps been informed by a moral value judgment on who ought or ought not to be commemorated, perhaps based on received knowledge about who was good and who was bad. War is never pretty, and the atrocities committed by the National Army at places such as Ballyseedy are unforgivable for those who perpetrated them. The danger here, however, to quote the late David Fitzpatrick, is that, quote, commemoration lends itself to crude stereotyping, and not all 40,000 members of the National Army can be portrayed as bloodthirsty perpetrators of the Ballyseedy massacre. If we can usefully agree that no one side has the monopoly on violence, we should not be afraid to offer at least some informed judgment on what happened, in order that historians should try to add moral intensity to the ways in which we commemorate and comprehend the past, as Fintan O'Toole has said. O'Toole would seem to chime with the argument that Fitzpatrick makes, suggesting that historians, quote, can be said to serve society much better by confronting it with the unadorned evidence of the human costs of conflict, unquote. Unfortunately, for each Ballyseedy there was a Knocknagoshel, the latter event involving the death of 5 National Army soldiers in a trap mine and leaving Private Joseph O'Brien with severe sight loss and a double leg amputation. For the 77 people or more brutally executed by the state in an attempt to suppress the anti-treaty movement, there was an as yet unquantified number of executions by anti-treaty forces. The problem, of course, is that state actors in uniform are immediately identifiable and rightly held to the highest standards of conduct, whereas misconduct by asymmetric forces is not. The degree to which asymmetric operations in the War of Independence and the Civil War had less to do with political ambition and more to do with sectarian violence and score settling against non-combatants is an uncomfortable aspect of our history and merits further examination. Historians such as John Borgonovo, for example, have detailed extraordinary episodes of violence, such as the extrajudicial killing of 13 Protestants in the Bandon Valley by IRA forces in April 1922, while Gemma Clark, as I mentioned earlier, has attempted to grapple with the phenomenon of what she calls everyday violence, including gender-based sexual violence in the Civil War, which had lasting and traumatic effects, if not lethal ones. Such activity also included the economic deprivation associated with the destruction of railways and road infrastructure, as Ireland's policy and acts of cultural vandalism, such as the burning of great Anglo-Irish houses, and finally, for the archivists out there, the deliberate destruction of the Public Record Office in 1922. Now, the above comments are not to somehow retrospectively tip the balance of violence and atrocity against the anti-treaty forces, but rather to argue that it is simplistic to presume that the National Army forces were likewise most guilty. The point is that only accurate, rigorous research and a strict interpretation of the sources can inform our historiography, which in turn ought to inform our commemorative activities in a morally sound and balanced way. And moreover, it is interesting to reflect on the degree to which the conduct of the official executions by National Army firing squads, as opposed to National Army outrages in places like Kerry, was state-sanctioned and driven in the main not by soldiers, but by elected members of the Third Dáil, notably Ministers O'Higgins and Hogan. Ironically, their successors in Fianna Fáil would later mete out executions to IRA convicts in 1940. While it may be convenient to account for the phenomenon of state-sponsored violence purely by reference to a blunt and bloodthirsty military instrument, it is perhaps a little too convenient to forget that democratically elected members of National Parliament were the ones who repeatedly ordered official executions to take place. These facts need to be accounted for in our historiography and a balanced consideration given as to how they might be commemorated. Ultimately, the National Army war dead might have died to fulfil the political compromise of the nascent new state, but their death and commemoration became something of an inconvenience. Anne Dolan's thoughts on the matter are very pertinent and sum up the issue succinctly and are worth quoting. How does a mother, a father, a wife remember their private, their brigadier general, their son or husband killed in the street, shot by mistake, when they have died in the wrong war against the wrong enemy, and when the next government looks on them as traitors? Can a father still say his son died for Ireland when he died to secure a compromise? This paper has raised a number of questions regarding the attitude of the state since independence to the commemoration of its Civil War dead. In many ways, to be balanced about it, it is difficult to see how the new state, with all of its contradictions and tensions, from partition to the Civil War split to severe economic challenges, could have dealt comprehensively and fairly with the bitter events of the war. The fact that commemorations took place in the 1920s at all, albeit to the memory of the great men like Collins Griffith and latterly O'Higgins, rather than to the rank and file of the National Army, is in some way perhaps remarkable in itself. In this respect, the commemoration of Ireland's Civil War has not just been ambivalent or partial, but messy, with a multitude of unresolved questions and compromise solutions that are perhaps part and parcel of statehood and nation building. Nevertheless, as O'Toole argues, there are always options, since commemoration, quote, is a matter of choice. It is not essentially about history, it's about culture, ideas of the historic that are always shaped by present-day concerns and power structures. At least some of the state's attitude to what we as defence professionals call the military instrument, using the dime paradigm of diplomatic, information and economic instruments of national power along with military, at least some of this attitude may have its roots in the particular character or cultural reference points of Irish people vis-à-vis the use of force and military service in general. One suggestion I would make here is that since Irish strategic culture is ambivalent, it is hardly surprising that commemorative culture regarding the state's own military should be likewise ambivalent. Strategic culture has been defined by Alistair Ian Johnson as an integrated system of symbols which acts to establish pervasive and long-lasting strategic preferences by formulating concepts of the role and efficacy of military force in interstate political affairs. Perhaps the clearest example of this ambivalence, as we have seen, is demonstrated in how the state can richly commemorate the Irish who served in the British Armed Forces in a variety of sometimes contentious conflicts, but chooses rather to ignore or at least sideline those who served in its own forces, excepting with the United Nations. Moreover, it would appear that the Defence Forces itself has never really developed its own internal culture of commemoration, since there is an almost complete amnesia regarding its dead from the Civil War, from the emergency period, and even, to a lesser extent, from the Troubles. The explanation here is not immediately obvious. It may, for example, be largely explained by suggesting that the Irish state has simply followed pre-existing and pervasive modes of commemoration from the received British Commonwealth tradition, while never taking the time to develop its own commemorative legacies and traditions due to the low status of the military in the Irish state for most of the 20th century. Further study in this area may yield some interesting results with a direct learning outcome for the role and status of the Defence Forces and its position within the Irish state and Irish society generally. In the meantime, we can probably do better to commemorate those who died in the service of the state. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure.
Okay, but time for a Q&A for a few minutes, or?
Can we get you up to the table, Steve?
Yeah. Just in case there's one or two still from the previous.
Yeah, any further questions, comments, whatever, gentlemen up there?
Wait 1 second, get your mic, please.
Thank you. I feel like Daniel in the lion's den. I'd like to compliment the last speaker. I think you raised some very interesting questions. What you didn't mention is the possible impact of the continuing conflict in Northern Ireland. Because I think part of the difficulty is that politicians were reluctant to appear to leave open the avenue that they were endorsing paramilitary activity. I don't think they're right, but I'd be interested in your views. Thank you.
Is this work? Yeah, can you hear me on this? Sorry. That's a really interesting point, which is an opener to gain time for me to think, as I say. But I think I would argue, I suppose, that when the then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern in 2006 decided to resurrect the Easter parade, the military parade past the GPO, that sort of was an indication that the state, after the period of the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement, was prepared, if you like, to reignite or to reawaken the memory of the state being born through armed force. And I suppose, depending on your point of view, you could argue that those who took the GPO and prosecuted the 1916 Rising didn't have a clear democratic mandate, even if they did latterly in the years following, if you like. So, I mean, when you look at the people we commemorated through the decade of centenaries, from O'Donovan Ross at the very start, at his funeral, right through, there's a few choice people there that we could pick out, which I think, if your argument were to hold true, would have meant we wouldn't have commemorated them. So I do accept the North-South dynamic, but I don't see that in this instance it would have precluded some kind of respectful and inclusive commemoration of the National Army war dead. But thank you.
It's worth noting, by the way, that the Guards have no difficulty. They have a very strong commemorative culture, including most of their members who died, as policemen. But the majority would have died in confronting the IRA or Republican groups. But so the state is quite happy on that side to. But it is.
They have a memorial in Dublin Castle at the Blackpool, the original site. Am I right? Behind the Dublin Castle, yeah.
That could also be just the influence of O'Duffy for 10 years, very kind of clear things he put in place there. He was there for a long time, So if you think about the amount of chiefs of staff that were going through the Defence Forces that first decade, and then you've got O'Duffy as one block for an extended period of time, who's able to put in place those kind of mechanisms and those kind of traditions, that is part of it too, I think.
Yeah.
Not the answer, but part of it, definitely.
Does it also maybe reflect, I suppose, for want of a better way of putting it, the more general acceptance of civic guards, stroke Garda Síochána, even from a very early period, even during the Civil War, to some extent?
Yeah. Once they took the guns off them.
Yeah.
Which was, well, obviously it was crucially important.
Yeah, of course.
I was in America recently. I'm still shaking. I mean, everybody there except the cat has a gun. If you're a cleaner, you're like tight. Yeah, right. Yeah. Sorry, Pat. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that Pat.
Just to extend the last question a bit, just in relation to specifically in relation to the National Army dead, I wonder, would you agree that, as opposed to a question of simply not commemorating them, has there been an effective policy of actively forgetting?
Yeah, and that whole sort of philosophy of memory and forgetting and all is really interesting. There's an historian called Jay Winters, who I think is at Yale, and he's done a lot of work on what he calls sites of memory and sites of mourning, and he looks at the difference in cultures in commemorating, for example, the First World War, and there's a perceptible difference in how the British and the French, for example, and the Americans commemorate their war dead. But I think that forgetting is acceptable to a certain extent, but as the Spanish have learned in the last 10 or 15 years, you can't, while you might want to forget some things, and in fact they even instituted it in this law of memory in 1977 at the changeover to the socialist government, you can't kind of get away with it forever. And if you look at what happened when there was an attempt to commemorate, for example, all of those who served in the Royal Irish Constabulary, including the Auxiliary Division, the memory that we thought was sort of gone away or had hidden, when we scratched the surface, the feelings that evoked nationwide, I think that was an indicator that sometimes we can overstate the degree to which memory or forgetting can be helpful. And I do think that the state, and this is my own obviously personal view, I ought to have said that at the outset, this is not the view of the Defence Force, it's my own academic view, but that the state surely has some obligation, particularly, by the way, given the fine job that the National Graves Association have done in terms of the Republican anti-treaty tradition and all of the wonderful monuments that are around, both in the Republican plot in Glasnevin, but around the country. So I think, yeah, I think there should be more done, personally. Eve has it. Sorry.
Eve? Oh, we're all Eve. Eve.
Stephen, thanks for a very thought-provoking talk. Can I just make the point that the Defence Forces did have an annual commemoration for their dead. Now, I'm not up to speed on what the present situation is, but I know that ran into some problems in the early 90s because that commemoration revolved around a religious ceremony, and there was some dispute over that. So it was put into abeyance for a while. But for many, many years, there was an annual day of commemoration within the Defence Forces. So, as I say, I'm not sure what the present...
And can I ask, sir, was that separate to the deceased members' mass as we would typically have in November?
Yeah, no, it was the deceased members' mass, but it was a formal parade on the square. But the problem was that it did largely revolve around a religious ceremony, and that ran into problems.
Yeah.
Eve? The lady up there.
Hi. Thanks to all of you for some really interesting papers. This is something for Stephen. I wrote a short piece about commemorating the Civil War that's going to come up on I think it's in April, maybe it's going to come up on the UCC website. And when I was doing my research, one of the things I noticed was that in the 20s and in the years directly after the Civil War, there actually was a fair bit of commemoration of National Army soldiers. Like I was looking all the anti-treaty acts, the main anti-treaty commemorations for Liam Lynch and for Ballyseedy and all that, those started in 1924 as well. But in the early days, there were National Army ones as well, but then it kind of disappeared. You know, it is something that I don't think anybody's... I suppose Anne was looking at I was looking mostly at newspapers, and her research was done before newspapers were easy to search in that way, so she didn't cover it so much. So I'm just wondering, certainly just as I'm just thinking about it as a way of some sort of research that we could do that to maybe look at the patterns of commemoration and maybe how it faded out after the 20s, I wonder.
Absolutely. I mean, the obvious one there is the handover of government in 1932, and maybe it had to stop or whatever, and that's fine. I would still argue, there's a separation in my mind between commemoration at the local level, even the family community level, and state level. And I would still argue, and again, it's something in the Defence Forces we're looking at ourselves in terms of our own culture. There is no listing of these people. Much less a monument, and I think even if you had stopped the parade up Marion Street that you're referring to in the 20s for political reasons, I can't understand, for example, why in Arbor Hill Church there wouldn't have been And I don't have all the answers, but it would be interesting to look at the newspapers.
Poor old Pat. Yeah.
Stephen, just to add to what you've said, I've always queried why is it that, okay, the Republicans lost the war, but they won the Battle of Commemoration afterwards. Now, Michael, you gave figures there, 16 Free State troops, National Army, killed in Waterford during the Civil War, 10 Republicans. Each one of those Republicans has a commemorative plaque, monument, whatever. Some of them have two, one at their grave and one where they were killed. That's for the 10 Republicans. For the 16 National Army soldiers, there's not one mention anywhere within the county. There's a huge monument now to those who died in the British Army during the First World War. But nothing for the National Army. And I simply, now Stephen, you've addressed a lot of it, but I just cannot get my head around it, that there's no commemoration at all for the National Army dead.
There's a structural part too, though, isn't it? Isn't there a structural component? Isn't there a structural component to this as well? I mean, okay, you've got the brigade committees coming into play very quickly for pensions, right? And so that means that the Republican movement can use pre-existing brigade committees to then do exactly what you were saying, Pat, centre in on an area. That committee is going to have people in the area who are going to go around and make sure that that works, because the NGA and those committees are one.
And
It's not like they're separate.
they're also linked into the Fianna Fáil political structure.
So it's all one
well.
talking to each other. In terms of the National Army, they go through so many organisational structures. We don't have a regimental system. And that's often, if you look at the British Army, a lot of those, they have regimental histories. They have unit histories. They build their commemorations from those structures. I'm not saying this is the reason, but it is an important one. You know, like those structures allow people to come together very quickly without having to go around the houses to get guys into a room to do it.
That's actually something Owen Duffy, as General Officer Commanding the Forces, was advocating for in 1924 in his last report to the Executive Council. He wrote a long tract on building that kind of unit identity within the military. So it comes back to what you were mentioning about Duffy and the Guards.
Sorry, can I ask Stephen a question actually myself? Was there any tension from those who'd served on the pro-treaty side with the National Army during the Civil War? Because you see a number of them, Michael Brennan, for example, continuing to serve as Chief of Staff at very high levels. Was there any tension there from our effort on their behalf to advance something like that?
I haven't, I must say, I probably haven't done enough research, and I will, well, this paper came out of a thesis I did for my Command Staff course last year or the year before during COVID, and unfortunately physically couldn't get to a lot of the archives. That's my excuse. But I'm not aware of that. But I do think there's something around the status. I mean, immediately when you look at the demobilisation and the resources that were not given for a variety of reasons, and it's not our what's the word? It's not our call to say that they should. You know, we'll do what the Defence Forces and the Army do what they're given. But I think there's something, what I mentioned about the strategic culture, there's got to be something in that. Yeah. I don't think you could imagine a US scenario, and that the scale is completely different, obviously. But, you know, if you go to Arlington, that there couldn't be an Arlington, which is the burial site for the, am I right, for the Union soldiers, you know.
Yeah, yeah. It is an amazing gap.
It seems to be an amazing gap. But I mean, I think thankfully from what I've learned for the last 2 days between your work, Michael, and the work of Lisa and other people and Eoin, it's not as if the evidence or the sources aren't there to find this out categorically. It might be 100 years late, but you know.
Okay. Just
sorry, I know you referred a number of times to Andole, and I can't remember offhand the name of the work, but in that she recounts a particular incident in relation to the proposed commemoration of Civil War National Army dead in Wexford. I think you're nodding, you know the one I'm talking about, the Ferry Carrick ambush.
Yes.
And Richard Mulcahy, who wasn't even in office at the time, personally intervened to stop that monument being erected at the site of the ambush. It was okay if they had it in a churchyard or somewhere like that, but the idea of public commemoration of National Army dead was anathema to him, because he just felt that perhaps, I don't know, maybe that it was just divisive, it was kind of raking up the past. Obviously the Republican side didn't have any reservations on that, but it's just interesting that somebody like Dick Mulcahy himself that effectively started the ball rolling in this collective official amnesia.
And I wonder, again, that one of the things I touched on there is that, you know, would anybody, for example, serving or retired, know how many soldiers died during the emergency? Between, you know, the Blackwater manoeuvres, diffusing sea miles, accidents in training, suicides.
There was a landmine. Went off about 20, I think.
in the Glen of Amal. And we had, in fairness, we have a memorial to that particular incident. But again, there's no. I'm talking about people in uniform. So how would the public at large be expected to know? Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, I think it's something we could go on talking about for hours and hours, but unfortunately, time isn't against us. But I have to say that was a really great session to finish a really great 2 days of a conference.